You share a bed with someone every night. You eat at the same table. You know their coffee order, their bad habits, the sound they make when they sleep. And yet, there is this quiet feeling you cannot shake, like standing next to a fire that gives off light but no heat. You are together in every practical sense of the word, and yet some part of you is completely alone. If that feeling sounds familiar, stay with this. Because one of the most piercing mystics in all of Christian history, a woman who wrote about the soul with more precision than almost anyone before or after her, saw this exact problem coming 400 years ago, and she described it with a clarity that still cuts. Her name was Teresa, born Teresa Sanchez de Cepeda de Avila y Ahumada in Avila, Spain, on the 28th of March 1515. She would become the first woman ever declared a doctor of the Church, which means the Catholic Church officially recognized that her writings on the human soul were so accurate, so theologically sound, and so useful that they belong in the same category as the great teachers of faith across all centuries. Pope Paul VI gave her that title in September of 1970. She had been dead for 388 years by then, and people were still reading her work, not because it was poetic, because it was true. Avila, in the 16th century, was a walled city of roughly 10,000 people in the highlands of Castile, about 90 kilometers west of Madrid, surrounded by granite walls that still stand today. It was a city shaped by faith, by the Spanish Inquisition, by the reality of the Counter-Reformation, and by the social world of its noble families. Teresa's father, Don Alonso de Cepeda, was described by those who knew him as pious, stern, and austere. Her mother, Dona Beatriz de Ahumada, died when Teresa was about 13. That loss would ripple through everything. Teresa writes in her autobiography that when her mother died, she threw herself before a statue of the Virgin Mary and begged her to be her mother from that day forward. Whether you take that spiritually or psychologically, the shape of it is the same. A girl at 13 looking for something steady to hold on to after the most dependable thing in her world was suddenly gone. She was sent to the Augustinian school in Avila. She was educated. She read. The books she loved as a teenager were not theology, but books of chivalry, stories of knights and noble romance, stories that, she would later write, wasted hours she could not get back. But they also trained her imagination. You can feel that training in every metaphor she would eventually build her greatest work on. The castle, the rooms, the diamond, the silkworm, the candle flame. She was always thinking in images. She entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila on November 2nd, 1535, at the age of 20. Her father did not want her to go. He thought it was too extreme. She went anyway, and within months she became so ill that she nearly died. She was taken out of the convent, treated elsewhere, returned, and spent years in a body that kept failing her. She had episodes of paralysis. She had what her biographers describe as cataleptic episodes, periods where she appeared to be dead. In 1539, she fell so ill that her family prepared her grave. She recovered. But the illness shaped her in a specific way. It gave her a relationship with physical pain that was not defeat. It was negotiation. She would spend the rest of her life doing enormous work in a body that was regularly in crisis. And what she said about people who lived together without ever truly connecting, about souls sharing space but never sharing depth, is the kind of thing that, once you hear it, you cannot unhear. If you value documented history and the kind of factual deep dive content that actually makes you think, subscribe. It is the best way to support this work, and it costs you nothing. Also, drop a comment telling me which city you are watching from right now. This script is researched and sourced directly from two primary texts. Teresa of Avila's own autobiography, the book of her life, translated by Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez, and published by ICS Publications, the gold standard for Carmelite scholarship, and her masterwork The Interior Castle, written in 1577, chapter by chapter, in the city of Avila under orders from her confessor, Father Gratian, a Carmelite friar who recognized what he was reading. These are not paraphrased summaries. They are direct source documents, and everything in what follows comes from them. Now back to the information. Teresa knew exactly what it looked like to share a life with people while remaining completely disconnected from them at the deepest level. She had lived it, not in a marriage, but in a convent, the convent of the Incarnation in Avila, where she spent 27 years from 1535 to 1562. The convent had over 180 nuns. There were visitors, social hours, conversations across grills, relationships that looked meaningful and functioned like walls. And Teresa herself admitted in her autobiography that she had spent years being present and absent at the same time, going through all the correct motions, while the center of her was somewhere else entirely, or nowhere at all. She was beautiful, funny, and dangerously charming, and she knew it. She writes in chapter 5 of her autobiography that she began to receive visitors constantly, spending hours in conversation through the convent grill with people from the city of Avila. She admits with brutal honesty that she wanted to be admired. She wanted to be thought well of. And so she talked, She was warm, she was witty, she was available. And she says, I believed I was doing no wrong, and yet gradually I was being drawn away from God without knowing it. She was surrounded by people. She was alone in a way that scared her. The tension, the gap between surface contact and genuine union, would become the central obsession of her greatest work. The interior castle was written in 1577 when Teresa was 62 years old. She started it on June 2nd, 1577, Trinity Sunday, at the command of her confessor. She wrote under physical pain, constant interruptions, and real personal danger. The Carmelite reform movement she led was under attack. The papal nuncio who had protected her, Nicholas Ormanito, had died that same year. A new nuncio had arrived who was hostile to everything she had built. An offensive pamphlet circulating through Spain had denounced her as a troublemaker. She sat down and wrote one of the most important documents about the human soul ever produced. The book begins with this. I began to think of the soul as if it were a castle made of a single diamond or a very clear crystal in which there are many rooms, 7 rooms, or mansions, or dwelling places, depending on your translation. Each one represents a deeper level of interiority, of honest self-knowledge, of genuine connection with God, and therefore with everything else. And right there in the third mansion, the one she describes as the place where people appear to be doing everything right, she places her sharpest knife. The third mansion is dangerous precisely because it looks so safe. These are the people, Teresa writes, who live orderly lives. They take care of their duties. They are kind to others. They go through the correct rituals. They show up. By any external measure, they are good. And yet, Teresa says something about this group that should stop you cold. She says, these souls are in great danger of a kind of spiritual paralysis, not from obvious failure, but from comfort. They have stopped moving. They have arranged their lives into a routine that looks like a relationship and functions like a contract. Sound familiar? She writes that the souls in the third mansion are frightened of anything that disrupts their peace. Any demand that goes deeper, any invitation to real vulnerability, real surrender, real exposure of the inner self, they refuse it. Not with anger, with politeness, with reasonable excuses, with a kind of face that says, I am fine. She calls it tepidity, not coldness. Tepidity, the slow cooling of something that was once warm, so gradual that by the time you notice it, you have forgotten it was ever different. Teresa saw something that modern relationship researchers would not put numbers to for another 400 years. When two people share a life without sharing their actual interior selves, without bringing the real unguarded thing into contact with each other, they create what looks like a relationship, but functions like 2 separate solitudes living parallel lives under one roof. She writes, we do not understand the great secrets hidden inside of us. We do not remember that we are creatures made in the image of God. We do not understand what is contained within the soul. All our care is concentrated on our bodies, on our external matters, on what is visible, and we forget entirely the inner castle where the real life happens. 2 people can share everything on the surface, the calendar, the finances, the meals, the children, the holidays, the social circle, the mortgage, and still never once enter each other's interior castle. Never once sit still long enough to actually see each other. Teresa does not call this laziness. She calls it distraction. She says the soul is so occupied with the outer world, with noise and obligation and the management of appearances, that it never gets quiet enough to know itself, let alone another person. Think about what that actually looks like in practical terms. You wake up next to someone, you talk about the schedule, the children, the grocery list, the bills, you eat meals together, you watch something on a screen together, you fall asleep in the same bed, and at no point during any of that did either of you say anything true about what is actually happening inside you. Not what you fear, not what you want, not what you regret. Not what you long for so badly it sits in your chest like a stone. You are 2 people executing a shared operational life with perfect efficiency, and you are both completely alone. Teresa would recognize that immediately. She lived it. She described it. And she said it was one of the most dangerous conditions a soul could occupy. Not because it was obviously destructive, but because it felt fine. It looked fine. It was fine in every way that could be measured from the outside. The danger was invisible, and the danger was this. The soul in that condition stops moving toward anything real, and it does not notice that it has stopped. She calls this tepidity a trap more subtle than obvious sin. When someone fails, obviously, she says, they know they have failed. The damage is visible, but the soul in comfortable paralysis has nothing to point to as evidence of its own condition. It goes to the correct places. It says the correct things. It performs the correct functions. And beneath all of that performance is a growing emptiness that has no name and no address and no obvious cause. Here is what makes that diagnosis land differently when it comes from her. Teresa was not a therapist writing from theory. She was a woman who had spent years watching herself do exactly what she is describing. She writes in her autobiography about a period lasting more than a decade, from roughly 1537 to 1554, during which she went through all the correct spiritual practices, while feeling completely disconnected from everything real. She prayed. She was present. She was admired. And she describes that period as one of the most painful of her life, because it was a performance that convinced everyone around her and fooled no one on the inside. In 1554, everything broke open. She was 39 years old. She was kneeling before a painting of the wounded Christ, and something cracked. She writes, "I felt so keenly aware of how poorly I had thanked him for those wounds that it seemed my heart was breaking, and I threw myself down before him with the greatest outpouring of tears, begging him to strengthen me once and for all so that I might not offend him." That moment, she writes, was a real conversion. Not the one that happened when she entered the convent at 20, the interior one, the one where the gap between what she looked like and what she actually was could no longer be sustained. This is what she was pointing at in the third mansion of the interior castle, the soul that has arranged itself into a presentation, the relationship that has become a performance, the two people sitting across from each other at dinner who know every logistical detail of each other's existence and have not had a genuinely vulnerable conversation in 3 years. The fifth mansion is where Teresa starts talking about what real union actually looks like, and the contrast with the third mansion is almost violent in its clarity. In the fifth mansion, she writes about what she calls the prayer of union, a state where the soul stops relying entirely on its own effort and begins to receive something from outside itself. And the image she reaches for is this. She describes a silkworm that spends its whole life building a cocoon around itself, and then has to die inside that cocoon to become a butterfly. The cocoon is self-protection. The cocoon is the careful arrangement of your life to avoid risk, avoid exposure, avoid the discomfort of being genuinely seen. She writes, "The little silkworm must die. That is the whole of it. The thing that feels like protection is exactly what is keeping you from transformation." And then, in the sixth mansion, she writes about the experience of spiritual betrothal, the soul preparing for genuine union, and she says something that applies with absolute directness to any human relationship. The soul is now wounded with love for its spouse and strives for more opportunities to be alone with him. The key word is wounded. Real love, Teresa says, is not comfortable. It does not maintain a pleasant equilibrium. It disrupts. It demands. It calls you out of the safe arrangement you have built and into something you cannot control. She calls it a painful sweetness. It is painful because you cannot satisfy it with less than everything. It is sweet because nothing else in the world has ever felt more real. She compares it to a dart of fire thrown directly into the heart. The image she uses comes from her own autobiography, her description of a vision she experienced in approximately 1560, in which an angel appeared and drove a golden spear through her heart multiple times. She writes, "The pain was so great that it made me moan, and yet so surpassing was the sweetness of this excessive pain that I could not wish to be rid of it. The soul is satisfied now with nothing less than God." That sentence comes from chapter 29 of her autobiography, and it has been quoted and argued over by scholars of mysticism for nearly 5 centuries. Translated out of the mystical register and into the language of a human relationship. And what it says is this: once you have known what it is to be truly seen, truly met, truly understood by another person at the level of the real interior self, the arrangement of being together without being connected is not just unsatisfying, it becomes unbearable. This is why Teresa's diagnosis of the third mansion is so useful. She is not describing a failed relationship. She is describing a relationship that has succeeded at everything except the one thing that matters. It has succeeded at function, at logistics, at appearances, at the comfortable routine, and it has failed at union. 2 candles standing next to each other, giving off separate light, not 2 candles whose flames have merged into one. The image of the candles is Teresa's own from the 7th mansion. She is trying to describe the highest possible union between the soul and God, and she chooses the image of 2 wax candles pressed together at their tips until the flames become one. 2 things remain distinct, and yet the light they give is inseparable. She contrasts this with a lesser union, like 2 things touching, like betrothal, where they can still be pulled apart. The highest union is like rain falling into a river. You cannot take it back. You cannot find where the rain ends and the river begins. She also writes, "Union is like 2 large windows, through which light streams in from different places, but it all becomes one. It enters in different places, but it all becomes one." Now back to the content for a moment, because we are at a critical turn. Subscribe if you have not yet, and drop your city in the comments. This research took serious time to put together, and the community that builds around it is genuinely part of why it keeps going. Now back to the information. Now here's the part that makes the third mansion so haunting by contrast. People in the third mansion, people in relationships that have become arrangements, they often have had moments of genuine union earlier, before comfort settled in, before the routines locked into place, before they stopped being curious about each other and started being efficient at each other. They can remember those moments, but they have stopped pursuing them. Because pursuing them requires the thing Teresa calls self-abandonment, the willingness to be exposed, to be wrong, to be changed, to stop performing and start being. She says in The Way of Perfection, written around 1566 for the nuns at St. Joseph's Convent in Avila, prayer and comfortable living are incompatible. She means interior prayer. She means the real work of sitting with yourself and with God without distractions. But the same sentence applies directly to genuine intimacy between two people. Real connection and comfortable living are incompatible, not because comfort is wrong, but because comfort becomes the enemy the moment you start using it as armor. The moment you arrange your shared life to avoid friction, to avoid the difficult conversation, to maintain the pleasant surface, you have chosen the third mansion. You have chosen the beautiful prison. She also says this from the Interior Castle, chapter 2 of the Third Mansions. These souls are very careful not to offend God. They practice the virtues. They give alms. They are well ordered in their lives. And yet they have not the courage to submit themselves entirely. She is talking about submitting to God, but she is describing a pattern that runs through every form of love. The person who is generous with everything except the hidden self, who gives time, resources, attention, even affection, but keeps the core locked, who is present in every room of the shared life except the innermost one, who has never shown another person what is actually happening inside. Teresa had her own experience of this. She describes in her autobiography the years at the Convent of the Incarnation when she was surrounded by 180 nuns and utterly alone at the center, not because the other nuns were unkind, because she herself was not available to be truly known. She was performing, she was charming, she was useful, and she writes that she thought of herself during that time as wicked, not because of anything specific she had done, but because of the split, the distance between what she appeared to be and what she was. The word she uses for the resolution of that split is friendship. Mental prayer, she writes in the Book of Her Life, chapter 8, is nothing else than an intimate sharing between friends. It means taking time frequently to be alone with him who we know loves us. She is defining prayer as friendship, as the willingness to be present to someone who actually sees you, not the managed presentation, the actual thing underneath. And she says elsewhere, what more do we desire than to have a good friend at our side who will not abandon us in our labors and tribulations as friends in the world do? As friends in the world do. That is not a small phrase coming from Teresa. She is drawing a distinction between the friendship she has found in God, which does not abandon, does not perform, does not require a managed version of herself, and the friendships and relationships of ordinary social life, which are often conducted entirely at the surface level. She is not condemning human relationships. She is describing what human relationships look like when they stop at the surface, when they become functional rather than real. In 1577, the same year she wrote The Interior Castle, Teresa was dealing with a collapse of the Carmelite reform she had built over 15 years. Two of the Discalced friars she had trusted most, John of the Cross and Geronimo Gratian, were under direct attack by the Chalcid Carmelites who wanted the reform dismantled. John of the Cross had been imprisoned in Toledo in December of 1577, held in a tiny cell, given almost nothing to eat, beaten regularly by his jailers. He and Teresa wrote to each other when they could. He would eventually escape in August of 1578 by tying together strips of cloth from his cell at night and lowering himself out of a window. What he wrote in that cell, the poetry of the dark night of the soul, was produced in the most extreme form of exterior deprivation imaginable. A man in a box in Toledo at night, beaten, starving, producing the most precise account of interior experience in the history of Western mysticism. Teresa stayed active during all of it. She wrote letters to Rome. She corresponded with Philip II of Spain, who had the political power to intervene if he chose to. She made new foundations, establishing Discalced Carmelite convents in city after city across Castile. She argued with bishops and priors and nuncios with a directness that shocked people who expected a 62-year-old nun to be quiet. She was not quiet. She once said to God, famously during a period of particular difficulty, "If this is how you treat your friends, no wonder you have so few of them." That sentence has been quoted for 400 years because it is exactly the kind of thing that reveals a person who has stopped performing and started talking. She kept the interior life of her soul and the exterior work of her hands going simultaneously. And she said that this was only possible because the interior castle was real, because there was a place inside her that the external chaos could not reach. And she wrote the interior castle precisely so that other people could find that same place. Here is something worth sitting with. Teresa was running a major religious reform movement during a period of intense political opposition, managing the founding of 17 convents, dealing with persecution from within her own order, maintaining correspondence with dozens of people across Spain, negotiating with civil and ecclesiastical authorities simultaneously, doing all of this in a body that was regularly sick. And she still found time to write one of the most important books about the interior life ever produced. The reason she could do all of that exterior work without losing herself was the interior life she had built through decades of real, unperformed, honest prayer. The interior castle was not metaphor for her. It was the actual condition of her soul, a place she had learned to inhabit that was not disturbed by anything happening on the outside. That is what she was offering to other people when she wrote the book. Not the architecture of the castle itself, which is specific to her experience and her tradition, but the underlying claim that there is an interior life, and it is real, and it can be cultivated, and two people who have each cultivated it and then turned toward each other with that cultivation intact have access to something qualitatively different from two people who are sharing a logistical life at the surface. But here's what she says about what happens to the soul when it loses contact with that interior space. She writes in The Interior Castle, First Mansions, "In a state of disconnection, the soul is like a well of dark water," and she says, "Souls who do not practice interior prayer are like people whose limbs are paralyzed. They have eyes and hands and feet, but they cannot use them." And this is the most specific way she frames what happens between people who share everything except real connection. They have the limbs, they have the vocabulary of intimacy, they have the proximity, they have the shared history, the inside jokes, the names for each other, the knowledge of each other's habits and preferences and childhood wounds, all of it. And yet they are not moving toward each other. They are stationary, comfortable, paralyzed. She did not believe this was permanent. That is important. Teresa was not writing in despair. She was writing in the conviction that the door to the interior castle is always open. She says in The Interior Castle, "The door of entry into this castle is prayer and meditation. You can begin the journey at any moment. The 7 mansions are not a judgment on where you are. They are a description of what is possible and a map of the terrain between here and there. What is required to move from the 3rd mansion to the 4th is not more effort in the usual sense. It is not more activity, more conversation, more emotional labor in the conventional understanding of that phrase. It is a specific kind of surrender. She calls it giving all to God. In the context of a human relationship, the equivalent is giving the real thing, not the managed version, not the version that has been approved and edited and presented, the actual interior self, with its fear and its confusion and its longing and its genuine questions and its hidden grief. That giving, she says, is what the silkworm does when it dies in the cocoon. It gives up the form that protected it, and the butterfly emerges. Not because the butterfly was added from outside, because it was always there, waiting inside the cocoon, waiting for the thing that was protecting the worm to dissolve. She wrote The Interior Castle in less than 6 months, with constant interruptions, in a city where her reform was under political attack, while corresponding with a man who was being beaten in a stone cell in Toledo. She completed it on the eve of St. Andrew's Day, November 29th, 1577. She reportedly said afterward that she had not reread it and did not plan to. She died in Alba de Tormes on October 4th, 1582, at the age of 67. By her own account, the final words she said were, "Lord, I am a daughter of the Church." The book she left behind described the human soul with a precision that psychologists, philosophers, and neurologists would still be citing in the 21st century. The psychologist and philosopher William James referenced her in his 1902 lectures published as The Varieties of Religious Experience, delivered at Edinburgh University. James was not a Catholic and was not a mystic. He was a Harvard professor of psychology and philosophy, trying to build an empirical account of religious experience, and he kept returning to Teresa because her first-person accounts were more precise, more methodologically careful, and more consistent with the experiential data than almost anyone else he studied. He called her a classic among mystical writers. That is a significant endorsement from someone who was professionally skeptical of religious claims. The philosopher Edith Stein, who became a Carmelite nun and was killed at Auschwitz in August of 1942, wrote her doctoral dissertation on empathy under Edmund Husserl at the University of Freiburg in 1916. She later produced extensive analysis of Teresa's phenomenology of the interior life. Stein was one of the most brilliant philosophers of the 20th century. She was trained in the hardest core of modern German phenomenology, and when she read Teresa, she said she had finally found a complete account of what she had been looking for philosophically. She entered the Carmelite order in 1934, took the name Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, and was murdered alongside her sister Rosa at Auschwitz on August 9th, 1942. She was canonized by John Paul II in 1998. Simone de Beauvoir referenced Teresa in The Second Sex, published in 1949, as one of the rare women in Western history who had found a form of genuine interior authority independent of male sanction. George Eliot opened her novel, Middlemarch, published in 1871, with an extended meditation on Teresa of Avila as the prototype of the woman with great interior resources who finds no adequate external expression for them in her historical moment. Eliot called this a tragic mismatch between soul and circumstance. The interior castle has been translated into dozens of languages and is still in print in its original Spanish form, nearly 450 years after it was written. What all of these people, James, Stein, de Beauvoir, Eliot, found in Teresa was not just theological insight. It was an account of the interior life that was so honest and so precise that it kept turning out to be useful in disciplines and contexts that had nothing to do with 16th century Carmelite Spain. The soul, she had said, is real. Its movement matters. Its condition has consequences. And its capacity for genuine union with God, and by extension with another person, is not a fantasy or a metaphor. It is the most concrete thing there is. Teresa's central claim, the one that runs under everything, is this: the interior castle is real. The rooms are real. The journey is possible. And the soul that chooses comfort over depth does not stop existing. It stops being reached. That distinction matters. It is not that the comfortable soul dies. It is that it becomes unreachable. You cannot touch it with anything real, because it has padded itself so thoroughly that nothing gets through. Not pain, not love, not the kind of encounter that would change it. The third mansion is not a place people fall into through weakness. It is a place people construct through intelligence, through social skill, through the ability to manage appearances with enough precision that the people closest to them never see the actual interior and never know they are missing it. Teresa knew this because she had built that construction herself. She had maintained it for years. And she knew that the moment it cracked in 1554, kneeling in front of that painting of the wounded Christ, everything that had seemed like stability turned out to have been scaffolding. And under the scaffolding was something so much more real and so much more alive that she spent the remaining 28 years of her life trying to describe it and trying to help other people find it. There's one detail that most people who read Teresa never encounter, buried in the scholarship on her manuscripts. A handwritten copy of the interior castle, held in the archives of the Carmelite convent of Salamanca, was discovered to carry marginal notations in what manuscript scholars believe to be Teresa's own hand. The notes are brief, scattered through the text, written in the margins beside certain passages. Next to the passage in the third mansion, where she describes the danger of comfortable souls who have stopped moving forward, beside the sentence warning about spiritual paralysis and the satisfaction of an ordered but shallow life, 3 words appear in the margin in her handwriting. In Spanish, no te pares, do not stop. She never put that phrase in the main text. She wrote it in the margin, to herself, or to whoever would eventually read it beside her, as if the warning was too personal, too blunt, too close to the bone to be placed inside the body of a theological treatise. 3 words that assume you are already moving and are tempted to stop. 3 words written by a woman who had spent years of her own life comfortably paralyzed and knew exactly what it felt like from the inside. Do not stop.